And we're live. Welcome, everybody, to yet another weekly performance roundtable of our code review group. I'll go right. Last week, we didn't have a call. It was only just Patrick on the call. There are some comments on the previous date in the agenda. We don't have to address it here, but I'll do this. I'll copy Patrick's feedback because it's Patrick's question because it's on the same topic being discussed today, and we can address it here for the recording, and then Patrick can see the recording. So the first issue we have to discuss is the microcode review front-end proof of concept that Thomas has built. We've discussed this in the previous call. We chose not to close it because there were still some things left unanswered that we would like to keep drilling and keep studying and investigating and see how we can, take some of it and use for our own GitLab project. And Patrick, please add your notes if you have questions or comments. But Patrick said, I watched the video and tried the proof of concept, and I wonder what's needed from the backend in order for us to make progress on this. I noticed that the proof of concept and the chart shows a single RPC call. Would a GraphQL query be sufficient for that? Thomas, do you want to address it?
Sure. I guess the short answer is yes, I suppose. It depends kind of how much you want to pack into one GraphQL call, because what this is doing is it's getting it's using the public API. So I was gonna refer to this in terms of like our internal, our internal APIs for merge requests. And say okay, it's getting the metadata, it's getting the files, it's getting all that stuff in, but the public API doesn't have that concept. So it's using the URL that you post in, it's getting all of the files for that URL. And I'm actually forgetting what I've done. The public API has the concept of an MR and diffs. And so you would grab those two things separately. So it's basically getting those two things, and I think one other thing. So yeah, I mean, you could pack all that into one GraphQL call, presumably. I don't think there's anything blocking us from doing that. It's just a matter of making it, I guess. I don't know.
But in essence, for your POC, that's not even the biggest. It's just for convenience, right? Doing one call, grabs everything you need from the back end, and comes back all in one go. But theoretically, we could do separate calls. I don't think the speed comes from that, right? Or
no, I don't think so. I mean, if you've used I think you'll agree that there's not a lot of speed to be gained from on the network side. It's like sub half a second, maybe, loading content. So yes, you could put it all in GraphQL. We could swap out the kind of the RPC-ish side of the thing with a GraphQL call, do all that stuff. I don't even know. Is the public API GraphQL-y? I know we don't have to be using the public API. I'm just wondering, like, if there is GraphQL on it. I don't even know if that's a thing.
We have a public GraphQL API. Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if all the things you're getting from the REST API is available in GraphQL though.
Yeah.
Not sure.
So I mean, it is possible if that's the direction that like the backend would like to put everything in to GraphQL, then it is totally possible to do that. I'm not sure that it would gain a lot from that. Now, that said, if we were to take some of these concepts and bring them into our internal app, we probably would gain a lot from putting them in GraphQL, I would guess. But
like what? Expand.
So one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that it's quick is the public API is pretty fast, and we give it an MRID and we say, give me the diffs for this. And like the only diffs that come back are unmarked up blobs. And I think a lot of time is spent in our internal API taking diffs and highlighting them, syntax highlighting them, breaking them up into lines and syntax highlighting that. So if we take this exact like what's available on this public API and put it in GraphQL on our internal stuff, it probably would be faster just because it's not doing syntax highlighting and it's not breaking it up into lines and those kinds of things. We do lose things because I noted in my caveats that like not having lines is a problem and will be a problem in the future, but it would be faster to not do that highlighting and that kind of stuff. And so we could port some of these concepts into a GraphQL endpoint internally, and it would probably speed things up there.
But the GraphQL versus REST-ish endpoint is irrelevant here. Is that you have an endpoint that's giving that unmarked data unsplit by line.
Yeah.
Just the raw diff, right? That's the biggest distinction.
Yeah. There's probably some very minor speed improvement we could get simply because I am going from one REST call to like 3 API calls and waiting for all of them to return before returning the data over the RPC-ish call. And so like there's probably some speed up there if you can combine all that into one, but that's probably not where we need to spend our like engineering time to get improvements. That's not the biggest source of issues.
Okay. Thanks. Stas, you want to mention your comment? Oh, Carrie, go ahead.
Oh no, I just think that I think you're right, Thomas. The most interesting thing to me is to figure out, like, I think we're all impressed, with the proof of concept, and so like what we should figure out at some point outside the meeting of like what's the path to an alpha, like an opt-in alpha product. So we start gathering that feedback and understanding where is this bad, right? Because everything's bad. So like, let's figure out what's bad about it. And before we start making like micro optimizations about like how many network calls we're making or what the like is, yeah.
Stanislav, do you want to bring up your point before we get deeper into that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we've discussed GraphQL, I think even on this call previously with backend team. And there is an effort by team which suggests using cache on client side to exactly mitigate GraphQL issues, because our GraphQL response times are not ideal. And so the way they're dealing with it is using local cache. So I was wondering, like, if we move to GraphQL, I think there is a certain threshold of performance that we won't be able to solve. Like, it will add a constant overhead to our responses. So just wanted to say that out.
Yeah, my experiences implementing my own GraphQL backend has been similar, where there's like, it's pretty fast, but there is like a low level, just like everything has to be resolved kind of overhead that I get with that. But I haven't done major GraphQL stuff like we would have here. To get to Carrie's point about like what can we do for an alpha sort of in GitLab, that's where things start to get really sticky, because a lot of the speed of this demo kind of comes from all of the interlocking pieces fitting together, and we're not going to be able to have that in GitLab. And it's hard to identify the fastest thing. I think maybe what we could do is bring in the like front end only highlighter that just drops the like unhighlighted blob of text and then uses JavaScript to highlight it when it's doing it when you intersect with it. So when you scroll to it, that's when it highlights the file. We might be able to get that in and speed up both the backend response, so it doesn't need to do highlighting, and on-demand highlighting on the front, so it can render it almost immediately and then highlight it when you get to it. That comes with all sorts of problems because, as we know, front-end highlighting isn't super reliable, and in order to do that, we have to load up, probably at least a dozen sort of like highlighters In the demo, I loaded up like basically an XML highlighter and a JavaScript highlighter so that we could do HTML and JavaScript highlighting, and that was it. We would need a ton more than that on like a real demo of ours, because we need to be able to highlight at least the top 15 most popular languages or whatever. So I'm not sure where the best speed improvements are, but that's where I would probably start, is just like getting like a quicker diff on screen, maybe.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that part that you touched on, the syntax highlighting. That's definitely one of the biggest changes here. For example, if we get to adding notes to that diff, we're going to have a problem, because right now we don't have any consistently identifier that we can use across backend and front end on this demo, right? We just have a blob. Whereas in our production app, we have every line is annotated with metadata that we can use to attach comments to. But talking to the syntax highlighting thing in particular, just so that everybody's aware, the source code team is at the moment working to address performance issues on the highlighting part. And roughly the strategy is going to be, we're going to be highlighting the problem comes from doing syntax highlighting in bits. So basically, if you do highlighting in the middle of a file and you don't start highlighting from the top, your highlighting might be skewed because of the context you're in. If you're in a class, if you're in a method, depending on the language. So the highlighting needs to be done the whole file at once. As you probably know, on the back end, you do that too first before you take the snippets, the chunks. That same thing happens on the front end. What we're starting to do now is on the blob, which is a different context, we're highlighting the first lines, then we're using a web worker to highlight the rest. Here, we will never get the full file on the front end. So we'll always be vulnerable to having a faulty highlighting there. Plus, there are shortcomings on the library we're using in terms of language support. It doesn't support all the languages that Rouge supports. So on the blob, some languages or some files were falling back to the backend rendering of it, which is not ideal. So I just want to make sure that we know that caveat going in. Kai, if he was here, he would say maybe it could be a nice effort and try out to see how bad it gets and see how it gets. But it's a bit of an uneasy situation for me to bet on something that we know from the start is faulty.
Kai has explicitly said in the past, well, this, we've never actually seen this break. It could break, but we've never actually seen it. So maybe it's a good improvement for like the 80-20, like for the, we can do most highlighting on the front end without problems. I just don't know. I don't know. Like, I agree with him that we probably could. I just don't know what happens over that line. Like when it breaks, how do we know? How do we know when it breaks? And how do we fall back? Because I don't know like how to identify that it's not highlighting properly. So it's like we would solve the 80% and never know about the 20 because we just can't figure out that it's broken. I don't know.
The way that we handle this, well, like you said, it's not detectable. So one of the issues we had was with Python files, some bits would look like that. Like it's, unless you write tests for all languages that are possible, it's very hard to detect. What we started implementing was actually the backend detects the type of file that it is based on the extension or based on some library that we use, I can remember, and it tells the front end, this is a Python file. And then the front end based off that, I'm not sure if it's a front end or the back end, but a component based off that decides whether to render it on the front end and highlight it on the front end or go to the back end and render it on the back end. So it's very much just programmatically defining which files get rendered on the front end and which files get rendered on the back end. Not ideal, but the failures would be undetectable if we try to run them all, and that it really is a challenge, yes. Even harder when we're talking about diffs, because we're taking essentially chunks of files out of the highlighted part. So that's the biggest hurdle for me in terms of like picking that part over to GitLab, is that's only one part of the innovations of this POC. The other is, like Stanislav was saying, is the caching on the client, aggressive. storing things on the IndexedDB. We could potentially rebuild this into our current app if we navigate all the complexity of the data and stuff, the data fetching and stuff. Some sort of middleware it could be a service worker that handles all that logic to make it simpler. And the other part is the bootstrapping, where we're bootstrapping it straight from a static page, an empty page, but we're not using Vue, which is an overhead. Again, those two realities of our production application and going from a non-Vue is a world apart, and the effort to achieve feature parity would be huge. One of the ideas that we come up in the past, talking to Carrie's question about how we get an alpha product here, would be if we had an opt-in, like you said, way to render a lighter version of the diff on demand for customers. We already have something like that where we offer the plain diff, where it just shows the raw Git diff output. One option would be to offer that as an alternative, and it would render this on a separate page. I'm just not sure if that's worth it if I can't annotate it with comments. That's kind of like my first thing. So we'd have to find a way to implement comments on this to even begin considering this as a viable tool for code review, right? I'll leave it at that. That's where my mind is at. There's a lot of gaps here. Stanislav?
Yeah, the issue you've mentioned with like partial highlighting, it reminds the problem with streaming when you can split a single letter into multiple bytes. And if you split these bytes into pieces, you cannot make a full like letter that was previously there. So it can be handled with text encoder. And I think something similar should be there for highlight.js, because the approach is really simple. You just store the buffer and you use that when a new chunk is pushed. So shouldn't be that big of an issue because it has also like tokens that were previously there. So I think it's solvable actually.
You mean the highlighting as a whole?
Yeah.
I think the issue with the highlighter, and so I haven't personally run across it, but so I'm kind of speaking just from assumptions, but I think the issue is that the highlighter literally doesn't know, like it has 100% of the text, but it doesn't know what that text means. So I think in like the Python example, it doesn't realize that it's within a string, I guess, or a comment. What was it? Is three quotes a comment in Python? I'm not sure. I think it is. I think the three double quotes is a comment, and it's supposed to comment out everything until the next three quotes, and it I guess it doesn't realize that it's in a comment once it enters it. And so whether you have multiple bytes of the string or the whole thing, it's just that the highlighter doesn't realize what scope it's in and doesn't highlight properly unless you have more lines on the outside of it. I'm not sure why in that example, because in that example, it's got like the function entry point, like def foo or whatever it was, and then it enters the function. So I would think it would be like, okay, we're in a function and I can highlight a function. I was assuming highlight.js would fail in weirder places where the diff starts like in the middle of of a function or something.
Yeah, it does. This probably just a problem with the grammar that they use on the highlight.js per se implementation of Python. But yeah.
Yes,
it definitely fails on those situations that you're talking about. Definitely.
Yeah. The more obvious one is where your diff just like if you're in the middle of a function, but it doesn't have the like function keyword in JavaScript and it just starts with some code, it doesn't know like the context that it's in and highlights poorly there. Yeah, I don't. So using a text encoder is fun. It's a good idea, and I have used that before to kind of stack up like a buffer of text. But I think in this case, highlight.js is actually failing in a much more mundane way. It just doesn't have the scope of the text that it's in.
Yeah. For it to correctly work, you have to set the whole file from the very beginning. So, yeah. It won't work for the diffs which have like 2 lines changed. So you have to set the whole file.
Yeah,
And that raises the question, like, is it a good approach for this to do highlighting on the client? Because we actually rarely send the whole file. We just send a part of it. And so I think in most cases, it will always be broken for us. So that makes me wonder, should we really prefer highlighting on the backend there?
Yeah, I think highlighting on the back end is the only way right now to say like this is the only way to do this. The only solution that I've thought of, and it has a lot of downsides, is every diff is always a delta from like the base file. So like the first time you load an MR, it says, oh, the original file is this, and it could be empty, or it could be, whatever the base is. And then like all of the diffs are changes off of that, which is, of course, that's how diffs work. But we could also represent that on the front end of like, this is the base file. We have lines 1 through whatever. The diff is only lines 30 through 50. And then we could highlight from there. We would have line numbers, so we could do comments, but it's that there's a lot more upfront data loading to like get the full file and then work our way down to a smaller diff from there. So a lot of downsides to that, but it's kind of our only solution to proper highlighting and being able to use like real line numbers rather than like the way we're using line numbers now are based on diff file hash and then a line number, which has to be provided by the backend because it's not sequential. We could have line numbers that start at 300 or whatever. So. And to the iframe point and to what Andre said, web components are essentially just an iframe. When you use Shadow DOM, it's all of the benefits of an iframe: style encapsulation, JavaScript encapsulation, but none of the downsides, which are like iframes are really hard to resize based on internal content. Shadow DOM doesn't do that. So it is essentially the encapsulation. However, it is all front end. So to Stanislav's point of getting a performance benefit from it, we don't get that. So.
Well, it's just partially a joke because it can actually work on our page. And the benefit of iframe is that it doesn't depend on our JavaScript to start. So it starts at the bottom of the body. And we can skip that part. We can just start loading our JavaScript for the like divs app, for example, and just resize this iframe to the whole screen, because most of the page is like fixed, set bar is fixed, header is fixed. So nothing really stops us from actually extracting the whole page to an iframe and loading our apps there. Just a weird idea.
Yeah, honestly, that's kind of how I imagined it. Like thinking through like the UX of like how somebody would work with it. I was like, oh yeah, this thing's already loading, but well, in parallel, and just pops open.
Yeah, I mean, I think iframes got a bad rap because they can be misused really poorly. But hey, I mean, they are a technology that we could use. The vertical sizing of them based on their internal content on our page, that's the worst part of them, I think. It's really hard to do, but other than that, not that big of a deal.
Yeah, and accessibility issues and stuff. But yeah, definitely, we know that they're in, and we know their struggles and the problems and stuff. There was one thing I wanted to add. It's 1999 again. Yeah, there was something.
Yeah, just load all your data in a 0x0 iframe, and then.
Wait, like a spacer GIF? Oh, never mind. Gosh, I'm old. I want to say something here. Yes. So, okay. So syntax highlighting is challenging. We've achieved that, and the question here, it's harder. So it's a very hard, intensive task for the backend to do that. But could we optimize some of it if we send down highlighted HTML of the diffs in one structure rather than per line? Would that make it easier for us? in terms of like not having to split it up, not having to spend it down a huge payload with extra overhead per line. Is that worth considering working around or investigating a possibility? Because here's what I'm thinking. If we find a way to get, hey, the backend just give me the diff, the whole diff for one file, grab that, I'll just dump it on the page. I don't have the raw line, so I can't use suggestions. I can't use that information to render suggestions. I would have to go to the backend to get the actual suggestion for those lines. I don't have the identifiers per line so that I can attach notes. That's my challenge. Is this something that we can optimize by stripping down all the metadata per line, grabbing the blob as a whole, grabbing the diff as a whole, and then the gap is how do we match notes with lines? Can we find some ways to do this? Whether it's UUIDs per line that get automatically calculated on the front end, but backend also understands that and then converts to a line hash in the back. Like crazy ideas, but is this worth investigating? Would it make the backend faster to give us this?
So obviously the bulk of this answer should come from Carrie, but I mean the like can we match discussions up to lines would be pretty trivial, right? Like if the backend is providing us a predefined blob of HTML, they could also just drop in the IDs, like literally just do the ID tag for each line that's the correct line identifier. And then when we grab discussions, we say, this discussion is for this piece of HTML that matches up with this ID. So like if they're already providing us the HTML precompiled, they could also put IDs in there. They could put any other identifiers, and then we could use the predefined HTML to match up discussions or suggestions or whatever.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Andre, because I was kind of like percolating in the back of my brain too. Like, well, we already have the highlighting problem solved in the back end. So, where is the slowness in that process, and can we get that out? And I want to think that it's pre-cached calculation. That's a whole different discussion for us. But yeah, I mean, like whatever format you think you want the data in, I think it's worth taking that spike and seeing, what can we generate, and like what format do you need it in? Like we can do anything, right? So why not?
Yeah, I'm with you. I think the syntax highlighting is a solved problem. If you need to make it faster, probably it's a solution that will have to live in the back end. Because all the solutions that we've come up with the front end, there's shortcomings. And if you want to replace a production level application, we should at least have feature parity, which we're not getting. So I'll put a pin on that, but probably address that part, which can we work with something that simplifies other parts that is not the syntax highlighting. So yeah, probably what you said, probably worth looking into. So that's what I'm considering writing an issue, is to try to come up with a way to, like Thomas was musing about, having some sort of identification of lines that is the same back and front end. We can use that to attach notes. Because
this is
here's
completely,
the kicker.
Sorry, this is a complete tangent, but I need to say it or else I'm going to lose it.
Sure, go.
That we're adding in GitLab the support for the patch ID calculation, which basically can take like, is this range of commits the same as this range of commits? And this is most useful for us for rebasing, right? Because there's no new code is coming in during the rebase, but because the commits have changed internally, it looks like a completely new set of diffs. So we have to go through all that calculation and caching and everything again. So we could be smarter once we have this about detecting changes between blobs of text, because that GitLab is already going to be calculating that for us. So we could probably have some savings there. I'm sorry, I totally derailed you and interrupted you from your. I apologize.
No. That's definitely useful, and that can open up different ideas and different possibilities. So definitely, thanks for that contribution. What I was saying is exactly just completing. So you didn't derail me at all. Is that if we're keen on investigating that is something that we could port back to our app. That particular thing of trying to find ways to optimize the way the diffs are delivered, without all the action metadata by the lines, and that would be a huge diet on the payload, on the calculations, probably also on the front-end state that we have to keep. And that would be an iterative improvement. It wouldn't be an app on the side. It would be something that we'll be bringing into the current app at the moment. So I feel like, does anybody else have any reason why we shouldn't invest time in that? We any roadblocks that are obvious that we're probably missing?
No, I don't think there's anything. I also note that one of the speed improvements, which is stashing or caching the diff files in IndexedDB and loading it from there the first time on visit 2 or more, is something we could probably implement in a fairly isolated way. Like, we don't have to do it the way that it's in the demo app with like kind of a global store and an event system. You just have a little stash of files, and if we have, it would treat a blob of HTML the same as a diff blob. Like, so we could store that as well. It wouldn't change it. So if that's the approach, we could do that to speed up the front end visit as well.
Sorry, where would you start the diff blob?
Well, so like the major pieces of the speed of this demo are storing a bunch in IndexedDB. The API doesn't highlight lines, and then it only highlights when you get to the file. And so if internally for an alpha, if the backend is returning just an HTML blob instead of like highlighted diff lines, we could just store that blob in an IndexedDB as well, in our front end. It's not every benefit, but it would be like a second visit or more benefit for our users. And and that would also be, if the backend is delivering our just finished HTML, then we wouldn't need as much logic on the front end to like go through and render each line and do that stuff. So it would be faster on rendering probably too. Once you have it in store, it would just be like, put this into the DOM. So we might get kind of two benefits there.
Gotcha. The reason why I asked is because in the past conversations, Stanislav has brought up the idea that the diff lines or the diff blobs here are the most static part of our app, so they don't need the reactivity of Vue. So essentially, what we should prevent is having to store the blob diffs in the Vuex state. We don't need it. Just put it in the DOM. And then if you ever need to generate suggestions, which we will, we probably just need to either get the line interval, request that from a server endpoint or something to give me the raw lines for those intervals, which will be easier to calculate because it's just that interval there. Yeah, okay, definitely something to drill deeper and to see if there's anything there that we can pick up to our main app. Right. One thing I wanted to bring up is the IndexedDB part of this demo. Now that we've shipped HTTP caching, or at least HTTP caching is working with the batch tips requests, how big are the gains between HTTP caching and the IndexedDB? Because a lot of the speed on this demo comes from being a standalone page, not having all the things around, which is very hard to compare with the real thing. But I wanted to kind of like get a better sense of that particular comparison on the current implementation. If we did all this work to move the request into IndexedDB and render from there and then get the thing from the server, would it be worth it in terms of time? Anybody knows? Or has thoughts?
Are we sure it's working right now at the moment? Because I think the backend part is probably done, but I haven't seen the work on the front end side. Has someone been working on this?
My understanding, and I could be wrong, once the backend part was fixed for the HTTP caching, the browser would be the one doing the leveraging of the caching. It's like the front end makes that call, the caching is caught, it's hot, it's not stale, so the browser would just return what it has in cache. It's not right? Do we still have to do some front-end work?
I think we are talking about different kinds of cache, because the problem was that we were using eTag cache, which basically requires you to have a round trip to the server. And that is a problematic part, because that round trip, right, I checked it right now, it took me 700 milliseconds to get to the server and get the response. And I got cached response. So we discussed making it client-side. So we have to pass cache key to the front-end side and do all requests using that cache key. If we do that, we can skip this round trip and use the local cache. The problem was that Chrome doesn't really work well with this kind of approach for some reason. It works well in Firefox, but it doesn't work in Chrome. And there was a backend issue. I'm not sure if it's actually completed. I've checked right now. I don't see like a cache key on the request in production, so I guess the front-end work is not there yet.
This is good. There might be some bits missing. I'll look into I think Patrick was working on that issue, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So it's the implement HTTP caching with max age.
Yeah, correct.
That was shipped in 59. Changes are now in production, and that was January 24th. We'll continue to roll out in 3. Okay, so sorry. For the benefit of everybody, I'll share the screen. There it is. That's the issue. It was closed 3 weeks ago. Changes are in production, and we'll continue to roll out the feature flag once we have the front end utilizing the changes. You're correct. We need to have that. Do we have an issue for it? Is this the one? Whenever possible, render the MR diffs from client-side cache. Could we use that for the front end? Is it applicable? Or should we create another issue to just explicitly implement the front end part of this? I feel like this is too broad. New issue?
It has a front-end label, so we can technically use this one.
All right. I trust you. So I'll unblock it. Ready for development. I'll aim it at milestone. Sorry for doing milestone planning live on this call, but it's worthwhile. Now that we have the backend changes in, we can follow on with using it on the front end. See, sorry. I'm trying to be as fast as I can. Awesome. All right, so then we can follow in with that in 15.10, and then the rollout of the feature flag can be turned on, and then we can answer that question. So we can pause the IndexedDB considerations, because again, the question here is, does the complexity justify the gains? I don't know, because right now, go ahead.
There's an overlap of speed improvement here, but HTTP caching wouldn't solve every problem that a local database like IndexedDB would solve. For example, I think that if you're visiting, say, an older version of the MR that you haven't visited in a month maybe or something, or the last time you saw it was a few weeks ago, I assume that the HTTP cache would already be emptied out and would not, I don't know, based on an age probably, whereas an IndexedDB database would still have every record that you've seen in the past, so it would never expire. It would never have to be reloaded. But I think there's a lot of overlap. It's just, I think they both solve slightly different edges, sort of the caching question.
Different depth of caching, I guess.
Yeah,
would offer much deeper coverage.
And
sure, go ahead.
Well, and so like if I'm not sure exactly how the HTTP caching would work, but like the benefit with HTTP caching is probably if someone else visits well, I guess it would, if it's browser based, it wouldn't. I was just thinking if someone else visits a certain thing and it gets put into a cache, but that would require a server round trip. So that wouldn't be the solution. So anyway.
Sure. There's one thing that is important, which is if you visit a new version of the MR, one of the things that this doesn't allow is to render things from the local cache while we're loading the new ones. However, we were still not decided whether we really wanted to do that in the case of the IndexedDB because of UX considerations. We've talked, like Phil raised it in the past call, about if I'm coming back to an MR that was just received pushes from the author, the last thing I want to see is the old version. Even if you're going to update in 2 seconds, like I'm already looking at the file and it just gets replaced by something else, it's a jarring experience. So we're still on the fence whether we would even render the things from the IndexedDB in the start when we know that the cache is stale. So yeah, so the benefit is there, but only if we did that rendering from the local cache right away when outdated. So for now, this is much closer to shipping. So we'll proceed to continue to push on the HTTP caching to leverage that. Thanks, Stanislav, for the extra context. But we won't exclude the IndexedDB work for now. There's also other work like the GraphQL Apollo persist that was until now done on local storage. I think they're working now on doing that on IndexedDB, which can also, again, lend us some more lessons and stuff that we can use in the future. But I don't want to discard it just yet in the case that we might want to go there in the future. Right, more questions or thoughts here? We haven't addressed
I
yet.
wanted to add one last point about code highlighting.
Sure.
I think we can use a progressive way to highlight code. So basically, as far as I understand, sending plain diff is the fastest way to show diff merge request. And if we can send that as fast as possible, we can just show immediately the code changes without highlighting. Then we can use, for example, server-side events to inform us that the highlighting has been done, update it on the client, and you will get a highlighted version without getting too much pressure to the backend side. And that also would exclude client-side highlighting, which is, as we've mentioned, is kind of problematic.
See, this brings me back to the flash of unstyled content of the first days of CSS, where we were sending unstyled content and then the CSS would load and then we apply the style. It's always jarring for the user. And I like what I'm hearing. Like theoretically, I can read the code and then it just gets highlighted transparently. It's like magic, right? And it could be a few milliseconds or it could be a second or so. So essentially, it's not too jarring, but I always go back to that thing. If we can get pre-calculated, cached on the backend things sent much sooner, it's a matter of having the data available to send on the pipeline, not the pipe. So yeah, we can try it out. I would probably invest time in working what Carrie was hinting at, like getting it much pre-calculated. Because we talked it in the past, like we know the moment that the code changes, it's on a push. It doesn't change anywhere else. If we can pre-calculate the data that we're going to need to render that MR right away, then when the push is done, it's ready when it's needed. That's where I probably would go. But that's just me. I don't know what you think, Carrie, Matt.
I don't remember hearing a reason why we chose not to pursue that idea. And that was just like, you might selected memory, like maybe it was just like a bad memory and I hated it. I guess other than caching, because yeah.
No, I think I remember the conversation, and at the time we were having struggles with Redis, and we said we're not going to put this on Redis because Redis is already overloaded. And then we kind of like, maybe we can use another store somewhere, but because this is, again, static content that we can just pre-calculate it, keep somewhere in a cold storage and just wake it up or fetch it when we need it. I don't think it was like a hard exclusion. I don't think it was a hard rejection of that path. It was something that we wouldn't pursue at the moment.
There's other, I think if we look at it from a heuristics perspective, there's other indications that highlighting is needed. right? Or that someone is going to be interacting with this thing. So example, if they come into the merge request page, they might not have gone to /diffs yet, but they're probably gonna. So like, let's just on the back end, let's kick off hey, do we have this cache? Are we ready for this? If not, start building it while they've got that 2 or 3 second window where they're like moving their mouse over to like click on the thing.
Since we shipped some improvements on the front end, Carrie, that window is much smaller. So right now, we're using startup.js to trigger the first calls right away as soon as the page is requested. So the time spent between the request to the page and the request to the asynchronous request that we need is kind of like just a couple of milliseconds. So probably the benefit wouldn't be too much. However,
but pre-rendering this content, I mean, to my mind, like if we should try it and see if there's an improvement, and then we can take that improvement and say, hey, we need more Redis cache. If you give us more Redis cache, we will have this improvement, right? I think that's the argument to make in that situation. Otherwise, we're just like theoretically like
you can feature flag it and check the results on one project without affecting the whole Redis farm.
Yeah, exactly.
So should we have an issue for that?
I think we should. I think it's worth digging into this. Also, I'll note, there are lots of reasons, but one of the reasons that we have that diffs call in startup.js is because going to the diffs tab is slow. And so we need to start it earlier so that when you go there, it's ready or it's getting ready. So if we had stuff pre-computed or if it was on a little bit faster on demand or something, we may not need that level of like, oh, we got to start this query early so that it's ready by the time they get there.
Yeah, I mean that really only solves some of the issues, right? But if the slowness that we're perceiving is from the back end, like let's just get rid of it. I mean, not the back end. We should keep the back end. I like my job. We should, but let's. So
the suggestion is just to get rid of the slowness. Yeah, I mean, totally. I agree.
Yeah.
Serverless.
We're going serverless.
Yeah.
That's our slogan.
Yeah.
I'm gonna update the document and put a tagline: "Get rid of the slowness." If you look at the agenda, it's right there.
Oh well, if you just open an issue again assigned to me that just says "Get rid of the slowness," then if you had just done that years ago, I could have solved this problem.
Oh, this is what you wanted this whole time.
Like I'm not kidding, Carrie. You got ourselves a slogan. So it's all right. Thank you so much for that. Cool. So who wants to create that issue? Carrie, I think you'd be the best candidate for that. For bring an issue to do that. Thanks. Awesome. Any more thoughts here, or can we move on?
Should we open a front-end issue to basically like proof of concept loading pre-computed HTML from the backend as diff files somehow, like in a feature flag or something? Open a front-end.
That's already above, Thomas, I think.
Oh, we have an issue for that already? Okay.
No, I have a note for me to open an issue.
Oh, gotcha. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, we'll open an issue and we'll see whether we're ready to schedule it or not, but we'll open an issue about it and we'll see if we'll get started on a spike on 1510 already.
Okay.
It depends on capacity, so I'll have to check. Cool. So we have 2 issues to open. Good stuff. Thank you for the discussion. Again, still too early to close off POC, so I'm going to keep this open and topic to be discussed in the future. More discussion points. By the way, thank you, Stanislav, for pushing on the syntax highlighting anyway on the progressive. Any work we should consider scheduling for 1510? You have a note here, Stanislav. You want to voice it?
Yes, I think file tree, new API investigation, and diffs server-side investigation are moving to 15.10, I suppose, because they are probably slipping from 15.9.
Okay.
And another another one is we've just mentioned that Patrick completed the backend part for the cache key for diffs patch. So I guess we can also pick that up.
As you saw earlier, I already set the milestone, so it'll come up in the radar. Thanks. I know that you wrote this before, so it's fair. All right. Any other topics of discussion? Any other things you want to talk about before we go? I'll hold off the awkward silence for a little longer. I don't mind. All right. No, I think that's enough awkwardness. Thank you so much, everybody, for a really healthy discussion, and I'm really enjoying that we're getting deeper into the meat of it all, and I think we'll definitely get some gains soon. Thank you so much for your time. I'll see you next week or on another call. And yeah, thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.